Hello, and I hope this message finds you well. I wanted to make a video today titled Absolute and Relative Realities: How to Minimize Suffering and Amplify Joy. And I know that's a very weighty promise embedded in that title, but these concepts, as you'll see, are quite fundamental to how we field reality and indeed what it is. And they really can produce what I think we all want in life, which is to experience less suffering and more joy through properly understanding and diagnosing what's occurring in each moment, how best to interpret that experience. So I'll get into more detail in all of that here. Oh, whoops. So I first need to define what are absolute and relative reality. And these exact terms, as I'm using them, derive from Buddhism. But as I'll go into here, they can be found, parallels for these terms can be found in many other fields, through diverse cultures and throughout different periods in history. So these really seem to be some core aspects of reality that, independent of culture and time and so forth, people arrive at. So, what is absolute reality? We'll start here. From the perspective of absolute reality, we view ourselves as part of a single life rather than as individual beings separate from one another. So, from the perspective of relative reality, I have my body. My body is circumscribed by a specific period of time. I have my story, my struggles that I'm trying to overcome. Within absolute reality, by contrast, all of these boundaries are illusory, are fictitious. And not only in this moment, but in all moments throughout time, there is a single being, a single organism that is being animated by spirit. That is what is occurring on the level of absolute reality. So, not my life, but life itself, from the subjective to the objective. Similarly, rather than focusing on linear time, so my life began in the past and it's heading toward the future, and at some point in that future, I'll die, we see things from the perspective of timelessness. So there is only a single moment, and time as we describe it, clock time, becomes an illusion. Albert Einstein, the physicist, explored a lot of this through his theory of relativity, which really challenged the supposition that time was objectively measurable across space and at different speeds and all those sorts of variables. He was showing that it's more a function of our mind than we might have realized. Extending this, oh, I guess I have something else to say first. Also, within absolute reality, when we realize these first two precepts, singularity of life and timelessness, we begin to feel more love, more joy, more peace, because the things over which we as individuals might worry become less salient. So again, there really isn't my life to worry about. There's only a single life pulsating, a single life existing. As I was going to say a moment ago, so these concepts derive from Buddhism, absolute and relative reality, but they can be found in many other fields. So I mentioned Einstein. Plato's realm of forms from within philosophy is highly similar to absolute reality. It is this series of archetypes from which objects, as we recognize them, stem. Same with Immanuel Kant's noumena, which contrasts with phenomena, which are what we experience in life, what we see. Kant believed there were these deeper objects which served as the models for phenomena. And David Bohm, another physicist and one of Einstein's heirs, spoke of the implicate order, which is similar to the void in Buddhism. It is this emptiness out of which all matter arises. So he had the implicate and the explicate order. We experience only the explicate order, which is relative reality, which I'll get into now. So this will be easier. We've already spoken about absolute reality. What is relative reality? Well, in relative reality, I am an individual. I am in that body in a discrete period of time. I have a story to worry about. The beauty of this is I get to experience physicality, I get to experience embodiment, really all of the sensory stimuli of life become possible through embodiment. But the downsides are I have struggle and I have suffering, right? So there's this hardship that comes with relative reality. Um, Similar consequences of linear time. So, because of linear time, or at least my perception thereof, I experience life as precious and I can fall in love with moments and not want them to pass. But also, I have to worry about separation and ultimately death. I experience my body as this singular vanishing thing. Maybe I become worried about protecting it, and hypochondria arises, or I have to deal with the chronic illness or whatever sorts of occurrences there could be with the body. Um, and beneath the emotions I ascribe to absolute reality, things like peace, love, joy, um, or sorry, above those, we'll experience more surface level or ephemeral emotions. So I'll experience day to day anger, sadness, nervousness, all of these things that really constitute life for much of us. So all of that happens within relative reality. So, how do improperly comprehending and diagnosing absolute and relative realities produce suffering? And I'll have two kind of branches in my video from this point forward. This is the first. So when I misapply these concepts, maybe something occurs within relative reality, but I'm trying to approach it from absolute reality. How does that create suffering for me? That's branch one. And branch two is going to be properly interweaving, integrating these concepts. How does that amplify the amount of joy in my life? So these are the two explorations we'll undergo in the rest of this video. So one way that improperly understanding absolute and relative reality is going to produce hardship for me is through loneliness. And loneliness, to my understanding, is created when we have an expectation to meet absolute reality within relative reality. So what do I mean by that? We are expecting to discover the feeling of oneness through an individual. Sometimes through friendship or through a family member. We might have very high expectations of a single parent, for instance, but more commonly through romantic love. We want our ideal partner, our quote unquote soulmate, to give us the feelings which derive from absolute reality for the duration of our relationship. So I'm going to meet this one perfect person, and I'm going to endlessly feel this peace and love and wholeness, and they're going to become my vehicle for it. I'm sort of projecting all of that onto them. We have the conditions for loneliness there because what eventually happens? This phase turns out to be just an infatuation, and it fades, and then we feel gypped. We feel like, oh, I was supposed to perpetually get these feelings that I did have in the start of the relationship from this person. Something must be wrong, and there's a breakup. And we renew this expectation, this pursuit to find the absolute in the relative. So this is a misdiagnosis or a misapplication of these two concepts. We are looking within relative reality for something which properly does not lie there. A second instance is when we say things like, why can't we all just get along within politics? Or when we apply both sidesisms within politics. Both sides are corrupt, or it's all just projection. The Democrats project onto the Republicans, and the Republicans project onto the Democrats, and no one really sees each other. And this becomes a way of just saying, I'm not gonna participate in politics. It's all BS anyway. This is what we call spiritual bypassing. A definition I have for that concept here is when we attempt to circumvent relative reality and live only in the absolute. So we always have these two levels, right? I do have a single body, a single self in discrete time. That is part of my truth. And also, I know that in the greater scheme of things, absolute reality is what is real. This body is an illusion. My story is an illusion, et cetera, et cetera. Spiritual bypassing is when we attempt to shear off one of these realms, relative reality, and live only in the absolute. So within politics, that means, I'm not going to vote, I'm not going to participate in this game. It's all just a mirage, whatever. And this is problematic because we are really avoiding a major part of our work here, which is to take positions. Our bodies require positions. How am I going to protect myself? How am I going to protect my family or people like me? These are political questions. These are part of the lifeblood of being a being here on Earth. So when I try to bypass all of that, I'm going to feel frustrated, empty, imbalanced in some way. Politics has consequences, and like it or not, we need to participate. Speaking more generally of spiritual bypassing, because this can occur in the emotional realm as well, it can occur in the realm of relationships. Say we have some friction with our partner, and we just say, I'm beyond this situation. I don't feel anything about it. I'm not going to engage in the drama. This is always going to create problems for us because it's a manner of kicking the can down the road. What I mean by that is patterns recur in our lives because there's something we need to learn from them. And the more we just prevent ourselves, the more we procrastinate, coming to terms with them. Need to drink some water. See, my throat clearing would be an example of this. Let's say rather than drinking the water just then, I was like, oh, everything's fine, everything's fine. I don't need to engage with this. My throat being dry is just an illusion. It would get worse and worse, and it would distract the viewer more and more from what I'm trying to present. So similarly, anytime we try to spiritually bypass an emotional or relational reality, it's just going to metastasize. And later on, it will recur, but in even more demanding and arduous a form. So the second of the branches I discussed, how can absolute and relative reality be integrated to amplify joy? So what is the proper way of understanding these two concepts? I spoke earlier of trying to shear off one from the other, generally shearing off relative reality and living only in the absolute, which is spiritually bypassing. I think as a model for understanding, the better way of merging these two concepts is to perceive them as a sort of funnel. And absolute reality is channeled into relative reality. So I do have the experience of being a body, being a single self, but there are also faculties within me that can recognize this greater experience, which is equally, if not more, true. And I can live with both simultaneously rather than trying to exclude one at the expense of the other. So let's talk about some cases of that. One is simply perspective. I have a statement here I like, so I'll just read it word for word. All perspective derives from meeting the challenges of the relative with the clarity, gentleness, and humor of the absolute. That is, not denying absolute reality and not denying relative reality, but seeing how the one can inform the other. So again, as an individual with a body, I do encounter challenges which need my attention, need my ingenuity, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, if I carry with me this memory that these challenges are not forever, they are ephemeral, and that from the perspective of absolute reality, they can even be minuscule or laughable, strangely, that helps me to cruise through them with greater ease and fluidity. So yeah, I actually do get to transcend these circumstances if I simultaneously engage with them and remember that in the scheme of things, they are meaningless, laughable, etc. So it's a both and that I can take here rather than trying to compartmentalize my experience. Yeah, so I just addressed this. How is this different from bypassing? Well, I'm not applying either absolute or relative reality. I am seeing how the two can interact to form a more helpful and useful combination. So this part is more definitional than tactical. What is vulnerability? Vulnerability stems from absolutely accepting the relative, which paradoxically connotes the absolute, um, paradoxically demonstrates the absolute. So, a way of sidestepping vulnerability is to attempt to rationalize my emotions and my behaviors, which is akin to attempting to um, pin those relative behaviors on the domain of the absolute. So, I'm being angry, I'm being irrational, etc., because that's the way human beings are. That's a way of kind of refusing to take responsibility for what I'm doing. Instead, we can shift from objective to subjective language. I'm angry because I feel blank, or I'm angry because I'm thinking about blank. And this places within my domain, within the domain of the relative, what I'm experiencing, how I'm behaving, and why. Um, and paradoxically and strangely, it allows the other person to see through me an example of the absolute. So, precisely by claiming my experience and the finitude of my status as a single human being, I show, I live into what it is to be a microcosm of the absolute. It's this strange sort of bend in reality. So, what vulnerability is about is not um, possessing the absolute, but rather letting it be seen through us as we ourselves kind of take responsibility for and step into the relative. I think the best explanation of this is the entire body of work of Ludwig Wittgenstein. He spoke about showing that which cannot be said. So we ourselves show necessarily the absolute through our relative behavior. This is vulnerability. It is accepting having a story, the smallness of having a story. Um, More generally, but this also links up with the first of my 3 points in the second part of the presentation. Any virtue like healing or compassion or understanding emanates from joining absolute and relative realms. So perhaps it's the flip side of what I just spoke about with vulnerability. We can either ourselves be vulnerable through embracing relative reality, or we can see the other as a product, as a mirror of the absolute. And through them, we can arrive at healing, compassion, understanding. So I don't see that person as, he's just a strange individual. He's an anomaly in space time. I see him as, oh, he's someone else like me. He's a vector of this greater consciousness, which joins us, who just happened to have been bent in this strange way through circumstance. And when I see that, it allows me to achieve the same kind of grace in our relationship that perspective might give me in my individual life. So we can reach an understanding and we can navigate conflict more easily when I remember another person's linkage to the same force, absolute reality, which births me and governs me, right? We share a mother, we share a father. So we have that sort of understanding. Um, just kind of hitting this home. Um, when we apply absolute reality in this way, it has practical effects. So it has beneficial effects within relative reality. This is quite pointedly not spiritual bypassing. It is using a greater perspective to more seamlessly navigate relative reality, which is really the point of this whole video. So, how do we bring these lessons forward as an apparatus? That is, how can we use the sort of system I've been talking about, this method of diagnosing absolute or relative reality, sometimes discriminating between the two, sometimes combining them in this sort of funnel or channel? How can we summarize all of that as a method which helps us approach moments of diverse appearance and kind? Here are some general questions for proceeding in this way. One, from which perspective am I seeing this situation, absolute or relative? So first, simply recognizing where am I in my headspace? Which ontology am I using here? Two, which is the more appropriate perspective? Would it better serve me to see this situation from absolute or relative reality? And three, kind of combining, how can the two perspectives together help me to arrive at a more nuanced truth? So how can I get away from this tendency to separate absolute reality and instead join the two in a whole? Through using these three questions and the more specific lessons I spoke about earlier, we can help mitigate misunderstanding and in that way increase joy and diminish suffering, as I promised at the beginning of the video. So thank you for listening, and I hope you have a blessed day. Goodbye.